Hola y bienvenidos oyentes. You are listening to the National Histories podcast, where today we are discussing the history of Argentina. If you are new here, I'd better tell you what it is that we do. So we at the National Histories podcast are telling the history of every single nation in the world, one at a time. And today is the turn of Argentina. I have with me, as always, Alex, Señor de la Valle. How are you doing today, Alex?
Señor de la Valle. Hello. I'm well, mate. Good. It's what I say every time, isn't it? Nothing new to report. Everything is all right.
Spiffing along. Excellent. All right. If this is your first National Histories podcast, I'm sure that you can see the problem here, as we're two cocky British guys talking about the history of Argentina. What could possibly go wrong?
Can I just? I would say one cocky British guy and one excessively humble British guy.
I don't know if I'd go for that.
No?
I reckon you can be cocky when you want to.
Well,
yeah. All right. Admittedly, there is a cocky disparity.
There is a disparity in cockiness.
All right. But we're going to be on our best behaviour today, aren't we, Alex?
Of course, as always.
So I imagine you would know quite a bit about Argentina, right?
Yeah, a fair amount. Pretty familiar with its sort of colonial history trajectory, and obviously familiar with it in its sort of 20th century history too, from Peron and obviously the Falkland War, etc. And studied a bit its debt crisis in the early 2000s as well. So plenty of stuff to get our teeth into for sure.
Well, yeah, I think we'll probably spend the majority of the episode on that kind of area of things. So I'm just going to go straight into the interesting facts. I'm sure you'll be happy with that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Okay. This one is something that's whenever anyone sort of talks about Argentina in the news these days, these kinds of figures are always brought up, but I think it's important to just put it in context because it is quite interesting. So in GDP per capita terms, there are other ways to measure it. But at the start of the 20th century, Argentina, by some estimates, was like the 7th richest country in the world. Okay, in terms of per capita income. So it was more wealthy than the Dutch and the Italians in Europe, and more wealthy than the Canadians as well. And you think at the start of the 20th century, American countries able to, not really dip into the world wars, but just make a load of money off it. You'd think that Argentina would have been able to be just as successful as Canada has been up until the 21st century, with similar sized population, similar amount of vast land mass, although Canada does have a bit more.
Didn't they have a really big agricultural sector? I mean, they still do.
Yeah, it's still huge. Yeah, and so, but they've got lots of resources that can be tapped into as well. So, although comparing the countries exactly is obviously not very helpful, you can look at all these countries. They definitely were set up for a good 20th century, and then from the 30s that just declined. So some estimates even put it higher than the 7th richest country in the world. But yeah, so I think this episode's going to sort of shed some light on why a country that was so set up so well for the 20th century kind of fell apart, really. And I think it's always a good reminder that politicians and making sure you have good ones is a good thing to do, because terrible politicians can drag your country down to the toilet. And although I wouldn't say that's quite happened to Argentina, it doesn't really look like they've got a positive 21st century coming up now. It's almost 100 years of decline now in some ways. So yeah.
Well, I think it's always good to remind ourselves of that while politicians are supposed to serve the people, they often can do the opposite.
Yeah,
and take it away.
And they can also, do that in the language that people agree with and stuff like that. So I think,
indeed, yes.
I think there's just, it's just a useful reminder that, people who say, politics doesn't really matter. Well, in the case of Argentina, it definitely did.
It definitely does.
So with that out of the way, let's get into the geography. So we have Argentina. It's kind of located mostly in the southern half of South America. sharing the bulk of the southern tip of South America with Chile to the west. And the country is also bordered by Bolivia and Paraguay to the north, and Brazil to the northeast, Uruguay and the South Atlantic Ocean to the east, and the Drake Passage to the south. Now, although the most populated areas are generally temperate, Argentina has an exceptional amount of climate diversity, ranging from subtropical in the north to polar in the far south. And historically, the small population over such a vast area of land has lended itself to having a huge range of biodiversity, which is present in the modern day, which is quite nice.
Sure.
And it does have mangroves, it seems, although the jury still seems out on that one on a quick Google search that I did just before this episode. So, yeah, there we go. It might have mangroves, according to this website about mangroves. But yeah, so quite a diverse country, huge, and that's something to bear in mind as well. Okay, so let's get into the pre-Columbian history. That is before Christopher Columbus descended on the Americas and ruined it for all the people there. So 11,000 BCE is about the first time that we know that people moved into the region. We know little about this civilization, other than it was likely almost always hunter-gatherer. But it did have one of the best pieces of art in the world at the period, called the Cueva de los Manos, and that is the Cave of the Hands. And if you show any interest in sort of prehistoric findings, you'll know this is the cave with all the silhouettes of all these people's hands.
Isn't it? Doesn't Harari mention this in *Sapiens*?
Yes.
And basically say that it's like the first evidence we have of someone like saying I was here.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, like
you when you used to carve it into your desk at school, like. Yeah, Luke or Alex was here, like WOZ 2010
I definitely did
or whatever it was,
and many other rude carvings as well.
I was going to say that's definitely the more palatable.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, very good. Really, it's just quite striking that, like, the dating of the actual art varies considerably. But sure. Yeah, it's prehistoric, and it's quite amazing, like just seeing all these handprints and just knowing that some old bloke's hands or woman's hands were just on that wall and they were like painting around it, I just think that's quite cool. Anyway, cool. So despite this awesome discovery and this nice piece of art, pre-Columbian history of Argentina is rather like the volume of it is rather dire, as it was predominantly hunter-gatherer groups with a few exceptions here and there, which we'll talk about in a moment. And basically, the whole area was very sparsely populated. Okay, the original inhabitants of Patagonia, that's sort of like the southern tip of South America, consisted mainly of Tehuelche Indians, who were thought to have come from Tierra del Fuego and then sort of like expand upward. They had several other groups more to the north, such as the Chachao, the Quiriandi, and the Puelche, and the Diguata. Sorry, all that. That was just terrible. However, we have sparse knowledge of these groups until people started taking an interest in them a lot later than European intervention. So during this time, you don't really know much about how they organised their societies. But it is also worth noting that the Incas conquered the northern parts of Argentina, like some of the northern parts,
yes.
Around 1480 CE. So almost at the time where Europeans started getting involved. The Incas started getting involved in the region and brought agriculture to parts of the region as well by this time. So we're looking at the population over the expanse of modern day Argentina was probably about 300,000 prior to European involvement.
Which is not very much at all, is it?
It's really not, especially when you consider
to other South American countries at that time, which were definitely well into the millions.
And especially,
but obviously, it would make sense if it wasn't as settled and it was more nomadic and hunter-gatherer still.
Yeah, definitely, and you'll have to consider as well that like most of it was in the Rio de la Plata region, which spans it's very much to the north of the country, and that's where the population density was, and still is, really. So, let's get on to the Spanish colonialism bit. Sorry that the pre-Columbian bit was a bit short, but it's really difficult to get information on that period at the moment. It seems like it just hasn't been researched as much as other indigenous populations elsewhere. I may be wrong. Maybe lots of it's just in Spanish, but I'm not good enough at Spanish to research it.
Or like really sort of obtuse archaeology journals and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Which we don't really have time to go through.
Or the funds to go through in some cases. Yeah.
No, indeed.
Right, so the Spanish came, and I'm not going to mention the Genoan this time, as it was actually Amerigo Vespucci who first arrived in modern-day Argentina.
Isn't Vespucci the guy who America was named after?
Yes, yeah. That is that guy. So Amerigo, America, same thing.
Cool.
So the place was noted down by Amerigo, and another bloke came along called Juan Diaz de Solis. So the people there, the Charrúa indigenous people, took one look at them from afar and thought, yeah, we've got to ambush these guys. They look dodgy. So which they promptly did and killed them all. That kind of got it off to a good start, I guess. So the early exploration of Argentina by Europeans was also like enhanced or like encouraged by this myth. Yeah, encouraged by this myth, and basically of like this enchanted city of the Caesars, where apparently there was a place of a lot of wealth. Somewhere there, but which in reality never existed.
So so that's cool. So it's kind of parallel to the El Dorado myth.
Yeah, very similar. I don't know whether they were just Spanish colonial officials like making up these myths on the spot just to like try and convince the gullible masses to go and do what they wanted.
Yeah, possibly. Or alternatively, it could have been indigenous people creating these myths in order to try and dissuade the Spaniards from settling where they were. And gone. There's this mystical land where you can get all kinds of riches and you can leave us alone and you can go and do that, and cool, good. Seems like a good compromise.
Maybe we'll do a short episode on these colonial myths. That might be a good idea.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
I think enchanted city of Caesars sounds like the scariest place in the world. I mean, Julius Caesar conquered everything. How do they think they're just going to turn up there and take all his loot?
You wouldn't want to be surrounded by a bloody room full of Caesars, would you?
Yeah. Well, you just think he's just going to stand there while you take all his wealth? Nah.
Yeah.
So whatever. Anyway.
Yeah, you can imagine like maybe there was like the mystical place of Caligula's as well.
Oh no, that'd be awful.
Not another place you'd want.
Well, yeah, maybe they would want to destroy that though, if that did exist.
Yeah, indeed.
Anyway, so they attempted several settlements in the Rio de la Plata region. This is Spanish, but they met a lot of hostility. That like the ambush was just one of several examples of hostility between the indigenous people who rightfully distrusted the Spanish. And so a lot of the early settlers really struggled with food supply. Soon many early settlements actually failed in the area, including the first attempt at Buenos Aires. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, eventually the area was settled by people coming from elsewhere in the Americas, and this period had an economy that worked from serf labour. A lot of the native population were forced into this, and they usually were used for raising cattle and horses, and basically they would be raising horses specifically for sort of exporting silver, like to silver mining areas elsewhere in the Spanish colonial empire. Okay, basically they were just producing what were then vehicles, for transporting stuff all over the continent. Politically, it was part of the Viceroyalty of Peru, which was relatively underdeveloped until its political life was reorientated when in 1776, when Spain created the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, consisting of not just modern-day Argentina, but also Uruguay, Paraguay, and southern Bolivia. It established Buenos Aires as the capital, and also established Buenos Aires to have like a direct transatlantic route from there to Europe, which helped drive the economy, because before they had like these set ports, where you could go back and forth. And
Right.
now Buenos Aires was one of them, so they could really develop the area. Spain did this as it was basically worried about the expanded power of Brazil, which was coming further and further down the South American coast. But it was not Brazil who would attack them, but the British.
Popping up again.
Yeah, I know. I didn't know that the negative opinion of the British went back this far, It's before Argentina's even a country and we're invading.
No, I wasn't familiar either, to be honest.
Yeah.
But this was all in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. So the Spanish had a terrible strategy of trusting a small left-handed Corsican man to move his troops peacefully through Spain to peacefully attack his neighbour. And then he betrayed them and just took over Spain and put his brother on the throne. Anyway, so the British didn't...
Put his brother on the throne, yep.
Before that all happened, the British didn't foresee this betrayal and decided to attack some Spanish territories. As a Napoleonic ally, they kind of wanted to just sort of take some chunks out of their friends, And so that's what they did. And Buenos Aires was their target, and they actually seized control of Buenos Aires for 46 days. And they also took Montevideo, which is now the capital of Uruguay, but it's on the other side. They're really close to each other if you look on a map. And for several months, they were basically took over that area as well, and lots of the Spanish colonial forces and the local militia, which was the primary driver, actually managed to kick them out without any additional help from Spain. And this helped with Argentinian identity formation, as they were offered little assistance from Spain, if any, and lots of people were like, we can defend ourselves, and then obviously after the Napoleonic Wars, like elsewhere in the Americas, self-rule was pursued as Spain showed itself to be just a bit useless the one time that it was meant to defend them, so on May 25th, 1810, a group of criollos established a parliament independent of the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, effectively making them de facto independent. And that's because among them was like military figures and so on and so forth. Initially, the plan was this was to be temporary until the rightful king of Spain was restored. But once there was a new king of Spain, he was viewed as basically French anyway, and so they just maintained their independence from there, because they weren't going to be ruled by a French monarch. No way.
Absolutely not.
And I can really support them in that cause. So come July 9th, 1816, which is 9 de Julio, they declared the country to be independent under the name of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. Argentina still celebrate this as their Independence Day, even though it wasn't actually Argentina, it was all these other countries as well.
Huh. Interesting.
And so that's like a geopolitical issue in itself for some nations around it, that they celebrate that day, but they considered themselves under the tyranny of this United Provinces. Anyway, whatever. So a war with the Royalists centered on modern-day Peru was ultimately defeated when Bolivar defeated them, from the northern part of South America.
Yeah.
And so they had all the hard work done for them, basically, by someone else. And from 1819, the question was now what would happen without Spain, rather than how do we get rid of Spain. And there were two opposing forces, basically, the Centralists and the Federalists. So it gets quite messy here, and I haven't really done this section justice, but it's boring if I go into too much detail. So, there we go. So
that's fine.
The United Provinces of South America, or Rio de la Plata, were not very united at all, and politically or economically at this time. The centre in Buenos Aires was actually not in control of much of the territory at all. And slowly many areas pulled away from the Union, and these territories went pretty quickly, actually, with like Paraguay going 1814, Bolivia going in 1825, and lastly Uruguay in 1828, which I'll talk about a bit more in detail in a second, because that was probably the most important one, with it being so close to Buenos Aires. Even in the modern day northern Argentinian provinces, they weren't actually really that united until 1860. And I'll also talk about that a bit more, but just so you have that context there. So many of the provinces of Argentina were at least partially controlled by these military figures, often referred to as caudillos, and during this period they held considerable autonomy from the central government and basically ruled as their own little regional dictators, basically. There were several early attempts to centralise power, which were largely unsuccessful, whereby most of the governments under the caudillos rejected the constitutional proposals for centralisation.
It sounds a lot like the plot of Hamilton so far.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? With trying to get all the colonies together, or former colonies.
Yeah, exactly.
And get that national debt passed. So basically, it is kind of like that, just it doesn't end so well. So America, they didn't have, the USA, they didn't have a war with Brazil, which is what Argentina had in its early years. So they had they had a war with Brazil over, basically they were fighting over the Uruguay provinces, okay? And both sides basically came to a stalemate, as Brazil were much more successful on sea and managed to blockade the Buenos Aires from the sea, which was like its main money earner. It needed to export to Europe from there. So it kind of brought the country to a standstill, even though Argentina had been much more successful on land and basically pushed Brazil all the way back to modern day Brazil. Now, the military who had fought in this war were quite angry with the agreement that the government made. So an agreement was made to recognise, because of this stalemate, basically, where Argentina could push into Brazil, and Brazil probably wouldn't be able to do much, but also Argentina were chokehold by this naval blockade. They came to agreement and said, okay, we'll just have an independent buffer state in between us of Uruguay. And the military, who felt they could go on and just keep winning, basically, saw this as like a sellout. And so they overthrew the government in 1828, and so were angry about it. Now, people outside of Buenos Aires quickly began to revolt against this new military government's authority, and lots of federalists met up in Santa Fe, and under the leadership of a bloke named Rosas, who's quite important, negotiated with the military, and they agreed to hold new elections, and Rosas was elected leader in 1829.
Right.
Now, that's very much like a aristocracy election. That's not universal suffrage or anything like that. Just to bear that in mind for everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, so Rosas handed over power to his legal successor. That was like a hand-picked successor, because there was a certain term limit that you could have. But everyone got mad about this and overthrew his successor because they didn't like him. I don't know why, they just didn't. And there was lots of arguing, and a compromise was reached, basically. But before that, it basically looked like it was going to go at civil war, okay? And lots of people were mad about the successor being in power, and then so they just reached a compromise whereby Rosas was made an absolute dictator, because obviously that is going to solve your situation.
Well, hang on a minute.
So
So we go from a guy who was elected because of his federalist principles, and we're saying that, like, by that time the contention over centralism had kind of dissipated, and then he gets made an absolute dictator, which presumably would have been against his own principles as well as the kind of like mood of the country.
Not to mention he was the guy who got together everyone to get rid of the dictatorship. Before.
Yeah. What?
Yeah, very strange. And whatever. Also, I just like the fact that there's an absolute. You give this guy Rosas and his legal successor. You've gone right. We don't like him. We like the guy before. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the Rosas in power as an absolute dictator and just do whatever he says. What if he did just go, well, I want my legal successor to be the absolute dictator? You just gave him that power. It's crazy.
Yeah. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
That's like the Uno reverse card.
Yeah. Weird, isn't it? So anyway, Rosas then got a bit North Korea-y, as it is now known.
Okay, good adjective.
Yeah, no, exactly. So he put in like a secret police that was quite brutal, and to show their loyalty, citizens were required to wear like these red favours, and priests had to display Rosas's portrait on the altars of churches, which is obviously
what's the expression? Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and
they've opened up a real can of worms there, didn't they?
Yeah, it didn't really
what could possibly go wrong with that.
Look nice, this, and he was very much
no.
His whole time in power, he was very much concerned with regaining the territories that were never to be Argentinian again. And this caused a lot of agitation internationally for Argentina. So the French were really mad about this, and for some reason, I don't really know why. Anyway, so from 1838 to 1840, the main weakness, which was this naval blockade, was again conducted, whereby the French blockaded Buenos Aires. And basically they were supporting Uruguay in a trade dispute, which caused lots of dissidents to be emboldened basically within Uruguay, and they started being supported by external forces who really just saw Rosas as a bit of a belligerent in the region who just couldn't accept that no one really wanted to be under his rule. So this caused lots of war with the French, and then the British involvement on, they came to Uruguay's aid as well. And later on, Brazil, once their civil war had been resolved, also started getting involved. So the Argentinians once again took a lot of Uruguay and had their capital under siege for a while. And then a rebellious caudillo, which is like one of those military leaders, Justo Jose de Urquiza, basically done a deal with the Brazilians and the Uruguayans, and in the Battle of the Caseros in 1852, he defeated Rosas, and Rosas escaped to England, never to return again. Okay, so he's usurped the government and done a deal with the enemy. So the economy during this time, just as a quick side, was mainly driven by the livestock industry, as it is a lot today as well. This period was later idealised a lot with imagery of these gauchos. Gauchos?
Oh, the gauchos.
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce that. And they were they're like cowboys, but, the cowboys of South America.
Like what they call, is it gauchos or pampas?
Yes, yeah. And and you see like a lot of they seem to have only sprung up across London over the past sort of like few years, but these gauchos restaurants, where they sell like Argentinian steak everywhere. But yeah, so
I'm pretty sure I remember watching a really good Argentinian film a long time ago about gauchos.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's quite a good.
Or gauchos, sorry. Yeah, I'll have to find it because I think you'd like it.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Seeing it, I know you're into the westerns and stuff. But yeah, cool.
Yeah, but so they're still quite idealised, and they play a particular prominence in Argentine national identity, and they've depended on the livestock industry throughout much of their modern history. And of course, because of the historical prominence of the native people to Argentina in these industries, a lot of them are like Creole people as well who are in this. And they're quite idealised and are sort of like rough and tough, ready men. So there we go. So Urquiza set up a constitutional assembly after the war in 1852, and in Buenos Aires, basically they refused because their main man, Rosas, was kind of kicked out, and so they refused to participate in this constitutional assembly, but they got on it. Everyone else got on with it anyway in the areas of Argentina, and adopted a constitution for the whole country. And the Union couldn't go on without Buenos Aires, as they controlled the import and export tax revenue, and so basically they all decided that they had to invade Buenos Aires and take it by force. So that's what they did, and so Buenos Aires was invaded in 1859, and they were forced to join the Union. Then a new civil war happened, and a bloke called Mitre came to power in a compromise that saw Buenos Aires become the capital in 1862. Right, so the early years of this united Argentina was dominated by embroilment in conflicts in Uruguay again, and also this conflict where everyone ganged up on Paraguay, and we'll talk about this in a Paraguay episode, but everyone ganged up on Paraguay this one time. So basically, unlike the other conflicts though, there wasn't anyone naval blockading them, and so this didn't really disrupt the economy in any kind of way of like the other conflicts had. Okay, so the internal stability and control actually made the country more appealing to European investment. Railroads, roads were built and the economy grew. And additionally was the huge amount of immigration that was coming in from Europe at the time with the 1860s and 1870s, which provided a huge economic stimulus too. Another civil war briefly broke out in the Entre Rios province, but when the new election basically caused a change in power, so Mita was gone. But in the years of peace and prosperity basically made the central government much stronger than it had previously been and much more capable of a quick victory. So that's it. Argentina's united, no more of that. So economic crisis happened when there was a slump in the European economy in 1873, which was Argentina's main export market. However, the government, still encouraging European immigration, supported the conquest of the desert, and which, if it really was a desert, it wouldn't be a conquest, would it?
This is true.
Yeah,
I've heard of this.
Yeah. So the so-called desert was everything below the Rio de la Plata region, which is actually a huge chunk of modern-day Argentina, if you look at it. And it was dominated by the indigenous people who saw the government who the government saw as an inferior people, and so ripe for subjugation. Anyway, until the end of the 19th century, Argentina was slowly expanding and granting Europeans land in these areas at a great cost to the indigenous populations. The 1890s were also very tumultuous as inflation was high and there was a rise of radicalism in politics. This culminated in a very unsuccessful radical revolution in 1905, but kind of gives us a flavour of where the country is politically. Now, during this time, the president was selected by an oligarchy, as I mentioned, and it wasn't until 1916 that a president was selected by popular vote based upon universal male suffrage. Okay? Now, it was no surprise that there was a huge political shake-up as soon as this happened, as this party called the Radical Front took power for the first time. And they had it.
It's always questionable when a political party has the word "front" in its name.
Yes, it is. Although, I think they were just no, they don't seem too bad as characters, generally for the time.
Okay.
So from 1916 to 1930, the country was ruled by this party, and throughout this time, they were pretty successful at creating a political system to rule the country. Okay. They were very smart at making a political machine. Lots of people talk about this political machine that they made. They knew how to rig the democratic game in their favour legitimately, if you know what I mean.
Right.
And this saw a decrease of power in the hands of the gentry, and more foreign businesses came, which the elite of the country disliked because they lost power. However, this foreign business, especially British money, which had been flowing into the country, like it built the railways and stuff like that, was like really allowing the country to prosper in European markets and their exports. And so there was a general like weakening of the country in terms of any economic shocks that would happen, because there's a lot of European money in the country, but also they'd all this investment in this infrastructure and education and stuff. Okay. Now, come the Great Depression, this dependence on especially Great Britain for investment and export markets like basically devastated the country. And so the Radical Party and their model did finally fall apart, and lots of people saw it as quite negative. So the military decided that they were experts on the matter of governing people and quickly toppled the government. And this is kind of where Argentina goes downhill, because it was from the 1930s that they slowly fall down the ladder of richest countries in the world, Anyway, so this was dominated by conservative thinking and kind of like fascistic tendencies. This military coup, as well, if you're going to have a fascist, they're going to do a military coup, aren't they? Anyway, and so they
part of the manual.
Basically, they repressed the radicals a bit, and then they had an election, and they actually won it in 1931. but they kind of repressed the radicals in that election as well, so it wasn't really fair, if you know what I mean. Because
Sure.
they kind of just made sure that no one else could really talk. Yeah. So anyway, so the military government, though, or not the military government anymore, but sort of one, they'd done a deal with the devil, that of course being the British, and that saw them basically secure a meat market share in Britain in exchange for some trade and currency exchange restrictions and protection for the British commercial activity in the country. And this was kind of like, many Argentinians saw this as a sellout, even though it was actually quite good in terms of, like, it was the best deal that Britain had ever given a country outside of its empire. Like, we will always, but like this, it was sort of something ridiculous as well. Like 20% of all our meat will come from Argentina. That's guaranteed every year for you. Which
that's a pretty
yeah,
hefty quota,
it was something ridiculous like that. And so it was a huge deal. But all these sort of like restrictions on trade and currency and stuff that the British sought for, as well as the commercial activity, which some people resented, especially in the elite, was why it was kind of seen as a sellout. And so, like, lots of social unrest and violence plagued the next election in 1937, as it would, as lots of parties were suppressed and stuff like that. And despite this general economic recovery that they'd experienced after the Great Depression, especially from 1935 onwards. Now, come World War II, Argentina remained neutral, but this policy was somewhat unpopular, as US military aid was not coming to them like it was their neighbours. Because if you basically supported the Allies, the US just paid you a lot of money. But because of Argentina's demographics having a lot of Italians, especially from sort of like the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, they were like, the country was really split on whether to support the Allies or the Axis powers, whereas other countries were a bit more inclined. Like they were a bit more diverse and so had a bit more of a national character in that sense. Anyway, so the government opted for neutrality, but it meant that they didn't get all this military support. And in 1943, the Conservative coalition's main military benefactor, the guy who led the coup in 1930, actually died. And without his support, the government was quickly overthrown again. Now, after a bit of umming and ahhing over what to do with their power, they decided to keep it. They basically get well authoritarian, banning the free press and banning political parties. And then the US came into the picture and said, hey, stop talking to Germany. And the authoritarian dude was like, okay. But some in the military basically didn't like this. They kind of did like Germany. And so, bam, another coup. Okay, so this was a full-blown military junta, and all the post-war democracies were like, Argentina, military juntas in South America until the Cold War doesn't kick off for a few more years, so do something about it, or sanctions. And so, basically, this led to elections in 1946, because they couldn't really afford sanctions. Meanwhile, a bloke called Perón, who was the central figure in the 1943 coup. He was the central figure in that. He'd been building a power base as like the Labour minister, and he secured a lot of Labour wins with sort of like retirement benefits and stuff, and he was careful to cultivate this around his own personality, okay? However, the Conservative-dominated military and the Navy didn't really like him doing all this stuff. So even though they're kind of all on the same side, they kind of weren't, basically, if you know what I mean. And so they took all these sort of like, there was some civil unrest, and they kind of took this as an excuse to dismiss him. But his supporters organised a strike, which forced like Perón's detractors basically to resign. This is actually known as like Loyalty Day for people who are still Peronists in the country.
Oh, really?
Yeah. because
because I mean maybe I'm jumping
stayed
the gun
loyal
a bit.
to him.
I'm jumping the gun a bit maybe, but he's an interesting figure because I remember reading about him a while ago, and I remember reading that he was kind of like a watered down Mussolini style fascist, but then he was also very progressive, wasn't he, in a lot of his policies?
In some of it, yeah. I think
sort of won the favour of the left.
Yeah, he was a statist, basically. He believed in extreme state intervention. And
sort of highly personalised government.
He kind of oscillated in his career between left wing and right wing by the general sort of like standard that we consider, left wing and right wing to be.
Sure.
Especially towards the later end of his career, he was definitely more right wing. But like definitely he wanted more and more military. Sort of like public control over things, which is what we're going to get onto. So basically, his supporters organised a strike, and Loyalty Day, they were successful. His detractors resigned, and then in this campaign, he campaigned for presidency, and in that 1946 general election, he won the presidency, and it was a narrow victory, but it was enough as he got like majority. His party got majorities in both houses as well. So he did this thing where he politically purified the schools and courts, declared a state of internal war in order to expand his executive authority, redistributed revenues in favour of the workers and nationalised public services, and gave preferential treatment to urban and industrial areas over their rural counterparts. So his wife Evita was also really popular, and unofficially she controlled the Department of Social Welfare. They were both really popular with the decamisados, which means or descamisados, sorry, which means the shirtless ones, which I just think is quite cool.
With who the shirtless ones?
Like the poor and the impoverished.
Oh, I see. Oh, I get it. Sorry, the shirtless ones. Oh, I see. Huh.
And so, cool. Because they kind of like did all these things, basically taking like all these like labour wins, like with like retirement and stuff like that, and also like nationalising public services, giving preferential treatment to these sort of urban workers as well. Definitely made them quite popular. And until 1949, this economic model was quite successful, largely because exports were like super good after the war. But as European economies recovered, and their colonies recovered as well in some instances, there was more competition on the global market, and eventually, like this kind of
up it goes.
Like there was a lot of inflation as well in the society. And so there was a lot of like raw import materials basically just became much more difficult for industries to purchase. Now, his efforts to eliminate the political influence of the church provoked disaffection in the officer corps, who were a lot more of them were quite conservative in that manner. And in 1955, he was actually overthrown in a coup, and he fled the country. That's not the last of Peron, okay? So... but the couper himself was then couped immediately. And so the military government then came in and had the aim of restoring a constitutional government, but they wanted to exclude the Peronists, which is obviously a bad idea considering how popular they were.
I was going to say that his popularity surely hadn't have swung that far in the other direction.
No, it hadn't, even though there were problems with inflation and stuff. I think he successfully, even though a lot of it was his problem as well, he successfully like kind of deferred lots of these problems on like external enemies, so like, it's the Americans, it's the British, or whatever. And so basically the military was not united, and the Peronists started coalescing around this bloke named Frondizi, who was like a radical who sought to readmit the Peronists to the political life.
Right.
So anyway, he won the 1958 presidential election and got majorities in both houses with his party. Now, he tried to restart foreign investment, which had obviously stopped following all these nationalisations and devaluations of the currency. This is kind of the problem, that they just didn't invest once they'd nationalised these industries as much in these industries. So they fell behind a lot in this period. And then, so basically, he tried to do this, and nobody really liked this, as he devalued the currency, and so it made the people poorer, despite a lot of them relying on imports. And then he also needed the military help to stay in power. Like, they kind of did a lot of, like, they made their presence known. Anyway, so the military actually just disliked this whole plan.
It's a very diplomatic way of putting it.
Yeah. And so the military basically disliked this whole plan, and after a while, they just decided to set up another government. So they got rid of him.
This is a lot of military coups.
It's just endless,
period.
literally. And so there was a split between two factions on whether to pursue left-wing Peronist dictatorship kind of thing, or a constitutional government that included the Peronists. So they'd finally gone, all right, we need to include these guys. And then, so the 1963 elections saw the Radical Civic Union come to power. And basically they tried to split the Peronists rather than deal with them. So they tried to make them fight each other. They were ultimately unsuccessful, although they did do a bit of that. So agitated Peronist supporters basically supported a coup, another coup, by Onganía, a former supporter of the coalition with the Peronists in a previous coup. And the government once again tried to establish some sort of economic normality by devaluating the currency and investing in infrastructure programs. These once again affected the lower classes negatively, and at first, riots broke out, and the left-wing violence basically just took off when one of the former coups was actually killed. So, in this violence. So, the military just saw all this chaos and then thought, you know what, we've given it several goes, but go on, let's just give it one more. And so, in 1970, they'd done another coup. And inflation returned, terrorism increased, and then another coup happened in 1971 because they just can't get enough, right? And this new coup basically announced plans to re-establish democracy by 1973, though. So at least they realised that military figures can't rule a country justly on their own. So military government was more allied to the radicals. And this did not allow Perón to stand. So the radicals are a separate party, just to be, even though you would consider the Peronists to be radical. They're not the radicals in Argentina, just to make that distinction.
Just to make it clear, are the radicals further left or further right? The Peronists
again, they kind of oscillate as well, but they're more free market thinking.
But they're even more radical.
No, I think they've lost, because they were an much older party, so they're a bit more, especially in these years, they're a bit more free market, do some privatization, that kind of thing. Okay. But the two parties aren't actually that distinct. It's amazing how they fought so much over these different economic models, and they're actually really similar. Even in Argentina today, all the parties are pretty similar, according to most international observers, and it's amazing how they find stuff to talk about, and get annoyed at each other. So so the military government liked the radicals a bit more, and they didn't allow Perón to stand as he was still exiled. But they did allow a Peronist coalition to stand. And the Peronist coalition, they won. And then they got a new president who then got Perón back into the country. And immediately the Peronists started fighting each other between leftist and right-wing factions, okay? And Perón was elected with his third wife, Isabel, as vice president. He always liked to have his wife involved, it seems. And they immediately started purging the left wing from the party, so they made it very clear that they weren't really in favour of all this left-wing stuff. But also in 1973 is the year that affected many developing and post-colonial nations around the world, which is the Arab oil embargo. And also, separately in Argentina as well, there was a large outbreak of foot and mouth disease. And so the meat from Argentina, which was their main export, was banned by several nations as they didn't want to risk it. And so basically, and then Perón just died. He just up and died like that. And then so Isabel took over, the vice president, and the economy worsened and political violence increased. So the military decided they would definitely get it right this time when they could. They would definitely get it right. They're just obviously going to get it right. So anyway, this lieutenant general called Videla takes the reins, and he closed the Congress, imposed censorship, banned trade unions, and he also put into motion this thing called the Guerra Sucia, which is the Dirty War. Yeah. And this killed between 10,000 and 30,000 people. And basically they killed them, but also they illegally detained them for years and then tortured them, and like they were the desesperados or whatever they were called, like they'd just disappear. So people initially, though, they welcomed the stability of this because it seemed that people were like, oh, that's all right, but more and more information and more families were just affected by the human rights violations, and people were actually like, no, at what cost, And so more and more people, especially this group called the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who lost their children in the Dirty War, sort of like started gathering in the Plaza de Mayo, and through these like weekly vigils. And because it was a vigil, it was like a religious thing, the government couldn't technically like get rid of it, if you know what I mean.
Oh, I see. So it didn't fall under like the category of sort of political protest.
Yeah, because it was just like a religious vigil, but they made it known what they were doing, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But still, it wasn't riskless, and it was quite brave of all these women to do this. It brought international attention to the government and what they were doing. So, however, the military government did hold on, and they did like lots of like curfews, and obviously fear of being disappeared was not good. So they brought the national debt down a bit, but still nowhere near good enough. And they also improved they improved foreign spending in the country, but they seriously overspent, and the deficit got way out of hand. Okay. And this is something that still haunts Argentina, especially to this day. I mean, Perón definitely overspent at times, and but like this was like a whole nother level. They just did not care. They just went on and on and on. Anyway, so it's Falklands time already. Or El Guerra de las Malvinas. If you're an Argy. Okay, so yes. South Georgia and the Falklands were invaded by the Argentinians, but the British retook the lands fairly quickly in 1982. Now, Galtieri resigned 3 days after the Argentine surrender, and his successor, Bignone, basically took over. And political parties were allowed, and elections were announced for 1983.
Now, just want to interject here. Obviously, I don't want to talk about Miss Thatcher too much, because obviously this is an episode on Argentina and Britain. But I remember sort of learning about the Falklands War ages ago, and what I found kind of ironic was that I interpreted it as Galtieri essentially using invading the Falklands as a sort of means of like whipping up a national kind of unity, right? Because things were going pretty south in Argentina, and
there was also a bit of so there was an international dispute with Chile as well over these islands in the Tierra del Fuego region, right? And that happened in like 1979, and basically the international court ruled in favour of Chile. And this was seen as quite humiliating, and I think the military. This happened before the coup, like still in Peronist times, or where Evita was in power. Anyway, the military were quite critical of this, and they were like, "This would never happen if it were under us," kind of thing. And so it was a bit like whipping up that national. They'd already done it in part, beforehand, and then suddenly they just realised an opportunity or something.
Yeah, I mean, but then on the other side, what I think he inadvertently did was allow Thatcher to basically do the same thing.
Yeah,
because that time, like opinion directed towards her wasn't very good, and this essentially gave her the perfect opportunity to demonstrate, her strength of character and will, which she did. And in her defence in this occasion, she did actually predict that it would lead to the fall of Galtieri and the military junta, which it also did. So
it did, yeah. And
one of the things I guess she called right.
Yeah, I guess. And they were gone, and elections were announced for 83. Although
I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that this is the last time that we won't hear of any more coups.
Keep them crossed, and we'll see.
I'll keep them crossed.
Basically, a man named Alfonsin won this general election, and as a person who had always been defending victims against the military regime, he immediately repealed the law granting amnesty to the dirty war culprits, which was quite interesting and quite a ballsy move, I think, in a democratic transition. Anyway, because we've seen other countries that are quite like Aung San Suu Kyi, she's very like not able to do that, kind of thing. Other countries where there's this kind of democratic transition, like they don't go straight for the figures who did it, but he did it and it was kind of successful. So basically, while some in the military government were convicted for these crimes, others were convicted for incompetence in the Falklands War, including Galtieri. Okay, so the military hated him, and there were attempts at rebellions within the military during this time. However, huge popular support for democratic government convinced many to stay loyal to it within the military, and so democracy was actually here to stay. Okay?
Oh, yes.
So Alfonsin had one job when he got in, and that was to sort out the economy. And he introduced a new currency.
No easy task.
No easy task at all, because it was a complete mess. Like, he had a difficult job. And this currency called the Austral. And he introduced wage and price controls, currency devaluation, and basically trying to sort out this problem with runaway inflation. By the end of his tenure, inflation was back up to 388% annually.
Oh dear,
which is just not tenable at all, like for a population. So the electorate basically voted for a change. So this guy Menem, who was sort of a Peronist, won the election, and he was still kind of bad at running the economy. Okay, but then a couple of years in, he appointed a man called Carvalho as economy minister, and he was actually pretty good at it, and he implemented a lot of economic stabilisation like measures, which brought inflation quite far down, although not really brilliant, but quite far down nonetheless. Okay, which was seen as a success. And then they privatised a load of state-owned businesses and introduced the Argentine peso, which was pegged to the US dollar this time. Okay.
Yes.
Now people stopped withdrawing their money from the country after all this, and all was looking quite well for the economy in 1992. However, come 1997, unemployment was still high, a recession hit, foreign debt was still huge, and the deficit was still very large. And so, even though the inflation problem was sorted, not all the problems were sorted. A new Radical Party candidate won the presidency called De La Rua, and he raised taxes and cut government salaries, which is never a popular...
I was about to say that definitely didn't go down well, did it?
But the economy also did not improve, as basically all the lack of growth basically meant that the government didn't really get any more money, and so they just managed to annoy a lot of people. So a load of interim presidents came and went after this guy resigned, because he had to go. And so then there was a little bit of an economic collapse in 2002.
Yes.
Then they defaulted on a lot of foreign debt, and the usual by now.
Well, not just a lot. It was the biggest default in history by that point, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah. And so 2003 sees new presidential elections, and this guy called Nestor Kirchner wins these elections. Now, Nestor managed to restructure some of the foreign debt, and he helped stabilise the economy. Though towards the end of his presidency, there was an energy crisis and an inflation problem. However, people were pretty happy about this, stuff like that.
Relative to what in the early 2000s, it wasn't as bad.
Relative to literally half of the 20th century, it was way better. He supported his wife's candidacy in the old Argentine tradition, apparently, of just handing over power to your wife. And so Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner She basically won the presidential election in 2007, and she continued these policies and managed to restructure more of Argentina's debt. She also legalized same-sex marriage in 2010, which made Argentina the first Latin American country to do so. Then Nesta unexpectedly died, also continuing the tradition of male politicians just dying.
After handing
power over to
actually, no. In Perón's case, he didn't hand over power to her, did he?
Although she had lots of unofficial power, in the government, so you could say it's still within the tradition. Anyway, so he died unexpectedly, and there was a lot of public sympathy for Kirchner over her husband's death. And so she actually won an absolute majority this time as well. And so she had lots more power in the 2010 general election, which she won. Okay. However, inflation continued to be a problem, but not nearly as bad as it had been. I mean, we're talking double digits instead of triple digits. So, and we're talking the teens rather than in the in the hundreds. We're talking 12-15%, which is still ridiculously high.
Still high.
You'd feel that in this country today. You'd know about it and you'd be annoyed about it. But compared to what it was, people could see it as a bit better. So you're probably thinking, well, these Kirchners are pretty good news for everyone in Argentina. Under them, they had much less economic turmoil. Well, unfortunately, here's where it goes wrong. So it's not all the Kirchners' fault, but it is some. Basically, all this debt restructuring, there were these US hedge funds who were basically not having it. And they were just like, no, you have to pay your debt to us first before paying all these other people because we're better than them for some reason. Whatever, anyway, they had these negotiations and it all fell apart. And then this basically put the country into another default. And because they couldn't pay for this debt to these US hedge funds. And so there was this man called Alberto Nisman, also, and he was basically investigating a bombing at a Jewish community center. So this is a different story. And he was found dead a day before he was supposed to testify before Congress. How odd. And so
not suspicious at all.
Yeah. Days earlier, he'd released a report which stated that the Kirchner government had covered up Iran's involvement in the bombing in exchange for a trade deal. And so she then blamed the domestic so Kirchner heard this, and then instead of so basically, maybe they killed him, maybe they didn't, I don't know. But then she basically blamed the domestic intelligence agency on giving the guy who was investigating this murder, or this bombing at a Jewish community centre, she blamed the domestic intelligence agency giving him faulty information for giving him... So she shut the domestic intelligence agency down and set a new one up. And of course people don't like that because basically that's just blaming the intelligence agency for just one word against another, right? It's not good. Doesn't seem very democratic.
It's a bit reactionary, isn't it? It's not the kind of thing you'd expect somebody to do if they weren't implicated. Yeah,
it's quite dodgy.
I know it's still contentious, but still,
you go to court and sort it out if you thought you were clear. I don't know, but anyway, there's also this whole thing with the Kirchners. So during their time in government, they spent a lot of money on public investment projects and stuff like that, in infrastructure. But it seems that they might, although the jury's still out on this one, it seems like they might have fleeced a lot of money from this for their own purse.
Yeah.
And of course, that's a lot of public money, which a lot of people are mad about. And I don't know how this has all ended. And it's probably going to go on for years. But anyway, Kirchner's, as you'll see, she's vice president right now. So obviously they can't hate her that much. Although it's a very polarised society, I'm sure, just like ours. Anyway, so,
and from what I know, public opinion on her is also incredibly polarised.
Yeah, I would imagine so. She seems like quite the polarising figure. Anyway, so this guy, Mauricio Macri, won the next election, okay, because of all these scandals and the default. And he soon reached compromise deals with some of the holdouts who refused to negotiate the debt. And he supported a politics of gradualism, which was basically do everything Kirchner was doing, but make small adjustments to appease their creditors in order to get more loans, okay? His term saw a double-dip recession and poverty rates crawl up to 1/3 of all Argentines. I think the latest figures is now like 40% of Argentinians are living in poverty.
Wow.
So he lost the elections in 2019. And public debt increased throughout his period as he didn't actually address this whole deficit thing, which no one will address because of this whole legacy of statism, you know.
Yeah.
And so they dramatically overspend each year, and then they just finance it with loans and loans and loans, and then it's a whole
which just builds up interminably.
Yeah, and so of course international investors are not very keen, and all these people who are owed their money, so that basically they give out new bonds to like service this debt, but of course some people are just unwilling to accept that because they don't think they'll ever get it. So anyway, a new president comes in. His name is Alberto Fernandez, and his VP is Kirchner, and and basically they've actually initiated quite a tough restructuring plan. I mean, this happened at the end of last year, 2019. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm pretty sure I read very recently in the Financial Times about a restructuring deal being agreed with some of their external creditors.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it's a bond restructuring deal. Yeah,
and so they've got that. Which is difficult. It's interesting because they don't touch the public spending, and it's all to do with import and export taxes. They just think, even though the deficit's so high, they think that, you know, if they're going to do these import and export taxes, they'll be able to like recoup some of the money. And basically the debtors are kind of happy with it. The creditors even are kind of happy with it. But it's actually going to be quite harsh because the one part of the government spending that they have done is they've kind of stopped they're not going to continue to rise the pension payments for like 18 months.
Right.
But in a country with such high inflation, that means that every month people are going to feel poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer.
Sure.
And also people on the lowest incomes are not going to raise that in a minimum income threshold. So again, like people are going to have to pay more and more tax on their earnings, even though inflation is happening. So, yeah, that's kind of it for Argentina. We'll see where it goes. Although they haven't been really impacted by the COVID crisis so far.
I think they've done better, haven't they, than the majority of South American countries? Or
yes, but of course,
neighbours.
The whole crisis, a country that depends so much on exports to countries who don't really need their exports as much or don't want them anymore. Mm-hmm. It looks like their economy is also going to take a turn for the worse, even though, like, you know, they were already, like, GDP went down in the Macri years, and it didn't, like, they were unsure on whether it was going to recover. And then now, obviously, this is just obviously going to make it go down.
For sure.
But hopefully they can keep a hold and they don't get, like, you know, a coronavirus doesn't just come to them late or anything, and they can keep a hold on that. Because that really would be devastating, I think, if they were not too smart. They can kind of learn from all the procedures we have here, just in case, I think, and all around the world, and look at their neighbours in Brazil and what a mess that is, and kind of hopefully they'll see something there. So they have been praised on their coronavirus response, at least, so that's good. But yeah, this whole problem of public deficit is just a mess.
I mean, yeah.
And just all this debt. And it really does, because there are just so many, like, taboos about touching public pay. You know, they're much more willing to raise taxes in that country. And so they do, and they've got ridiculous taxes on everything. But of course it makes all their export markets a lot less... The more you raise taxes, the less competitive your export market's going to be, aren't they?
Sure.
You're going to be to other countries. So they need to be somewhere near those other countries, you know, and currently they're just not really. It's kind of, no. I don't know. It seems, again, it's like another one of these ones where it's hard to make up, like, you know, where I sit on the spectrum in Argentina, because I don't really like any of them. You know?
No.
I do not envy voters in Argentina, because it's just so much needs to happen, so much structural change needs to happen to that country to make it, like, work. And it just seems like they've just keep putting a band-aid on it, and it keeps getting worse, and they're not addressing it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think putting the band-aid on that's not big enough for the cut is probably the best analogy, because it is a very deep abrasion, you know.
Or maybe it's just putting a band-aid on an infection, and the infection keeps getting pussier and pussier and pussier, and they just keep putting a band-aid
inside
on
of your body, not on your skin, man.
Yeah, and that's kind of what they keep doing.
Yeah,
I understand there's like lots of difficulties for the people in power, because like the unions hold quite a lot of sway, and obviously there is this public taboo of like, you know, not touching public sector pay, and when like 40% or something of their country are just all on like welfare, you know, of some kind, like of the working population in some way. Obviously, when you're in a situation of like crazy, so the government's spending a huge chunk of money on this kind of stuff, and it's kind of really bad, because obviously if they cut public spending in like all these like meaningful areas, it's going to put so many Argentinians into destitution. But if they make like if they make meaningful, like, but they kind of need to, because more and more people are going to go into a destitution in future. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's really difficult, because then how are they going to grow as a country if all these people are in poverty? Like, you know,
I mean, in well, I say not in their defense necessarily, but it is a bit like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's like whatever you choose to do, it kind of isn't going to work. Yeah,
I feel a lot of like Western institutions like to look at these situations, go, oh well, it's well easy, just, you know, just go over there and, you know, privatize everything, and that'll be that, you know, and everyone will be happy and hunky dory, and oh yeah, and just cut that. Yeah, it's tough, but whatever, and then that'll be it. But I don't think you can look at it that simply, because it really is like so many people who really depend on the state in some ways, either through public pay or and when it's an inflation as well, like you've got no security month on month on month, you know. So it's really, I definitely would not like to be in that situation myself, and I'm glad I'm not yet. Anyway,
no. It's a difficult one. I mean, it's very interesting, but I mean, I don't envy the person whose job it is to try and sort that out. Not that anyone necessarily has, you know, been doing that well at that, but
anyway, right, I'm going to leave it there. I think we should. So, first of all, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and this has maybe helped you think about how things are run in your own country as much as about the Argentina and the Argentine difficulties and their history. But thank you for listening nonetheless, and please like and subscribe to our podcast feed and like our social media and stuff. We've got an Instagram, we've got a Twitter, we've got a Facebook page. Also, we're going to have a YouTube page as well. We've got a few videos coming out that we're going to do. Don't know dates on them yet. They might actually be out by the time this is out. Not sure. But anyway, if you want to check out, if you like this kind of stuff but you want it a bit shorter, a bit more visually engaging, there's another platform there. So there we go. I guess I've just got to say adios.
Adios.